Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I was the last one awake at Camp Hollow Creek that night. The fire had burned low, reduced to glowing embers, and the others were deep in their sleeping bags, their soft snores filling the air. I should have been tired, but something kept me up, a strange pull in the pit of my stomach, like an itch I couldn't scratch. That's when I saw the light. It flickered through the trees, faint at first, like a weak firefly darting in and out of the shadows. I thought maybe someone had forgotten their flashlight, or maybe it was one of the counselors sneaking back from their late night smoke break. But as I watched, the light didn't fade or move away. It grew brighter, pulsing softly, like it was alive. Curiosity got the better of me. I slipped on my shoes, careful not to wake anyone, and stepped into the trees. The air was colder under the canopy, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. The light was ahead, swaying gently, like it was waiting for me. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The light stayed still for a moment, then moved deeper into the woods. My heart raced, but I followed. Something about it felt wrong. As I got closer, I saw him. A man stood in the clearing, holding a lantern that seemed impossibly bright. It wasn't like any lantern I'd ever seen. The glass shimmered, and the flame inside wasn't orange, but a deep, eerie blue. It didn't flicker like a normal flame. It pulsed steadily like a heartbeat. The man's face was pale, almost translucent. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to drink in the light of the lantern. His lips moved, whispering something I couldn't hear. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn back, but my feet stayed rooted to the spot. Then he spoke. "Follow me," he said, his voice like dry leaves scraping against each other. "Or they'll take you too." My throat went dry. "Oh, who will take me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking, the lantern's light casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to slither across the ground. Behind me, I heard something, a sound that sent a chill racing down my spine. It was laughter, high and sharp, but not the kind of laughter you want to hear. It wasn't my friends. It couldn't be. This laughter was wrong. It echoed strangely, too loud and too close, like it was coming from everywhere at once. Then the laughter turned into screams. I spun around, my heart pounding. The campsite was just beyond the trees, but it felt a world away. The screams were muffled now, like they were being dragged underwater. I took a step toward the camp, but the man's voice cut through the air. "Don't go back," he said, his tone flat, emotionless. "They've already found them." My legs trembled, but I couldn't look away from the man. The lantern's light seemed to wrap around me, pulling me closer. "What do you mean? Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. He stopped walking and turned to face me. His empty eyes bored into mine. "You shouldn't have stayed awake. They come for the ones who stay awake." My stomach dropped. "Oh." He raised a hand and pointed toward the camp. "Look." I turned, and my breath caught in my throat. Shapes moved in the shadows, tall, twisted figures that barely looked human. Their limbs were too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. They circled the campsite, and as I watched, one of them bent low over a sleeping bag. It reached inside, its spindly arm disappearing into the fabric, and pulled out something. I couldn't tell what it was, a shape writhing and dark, like a piece of shadow made solid. The thing let out a horrible, guttural shriek, and the other figures joined in, their laughter cutting through the night like broken glass. I stumbled back, my legs barely holding me up. What? What are they? They are the hollow, the man said. They take what you leave behind. Your warmth, your life, your soul. I turned back to him, desperate. What do? How do I stop them? You can't, he said simply, but you can follow me. The lantern keeps them away. I didn't want to trust him. I didn't want to trust anyone or anything in that moment. But the screams behind me were growing louder. The shapes were moving closer, their shadows stretching toward me like claws. I ran to the man, the cold light of the lantern washing over me. As soon as I stepped into its glow, the sounds faded. The screams, the laughter, even the rustling of the trees. It all disappeared, leaving only an eerie silence. He started walking again, and this time I followed without hesitation. We walked for what felt like hours, the forest around us growing darker and colder with every step. I glanced back once, and I saw them, the hollow, lingering at the edge of the lantern's light. They didn't chase us. They didn't have to. They just waited, their empty eyes watching, their mouths stretched into terrible, hungry grins. The man never spoke again, and neither did I. We just walked, the lantern guiding us through the endless night. I never saw the sun rise. Story 2. We all heard the story that first night at the campfire. Jim, the self-proclaimed expert on local legends, leaned in close as the flames cast long shadows across his face. They call it the shifting skin, he whispered, his voice low and heavy. It wears the faces of people you know, mimicking their voices, their mannerisms, even their scent. And once it calls you into the woods, you never come back. We laughed, nervously at first, then harder, dismissing it as another ghost story meant to scare the newcomers. But later that night, as the fire burned down to embers and the forest wrapped itself around us like a living thing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Watching, waiting. The first scream came around midnight. I bolted upright in my sleeping bag, heart hammering. The sound was faint but unmistakable, someone shouting for help. I recognized the voice immediately. Will, my brother. I scrambled out of the tent, my headlamp bobbing as I ran toward the noise. The others yelled after me, but I didn't stop. How could I? Will's voice was frantic, raw with terror. Help me, please. The forest swallowed me whole, the trees thick and tangled. The air was colder here, sharp and damp, as if I'd crossed into another world. My headlamp carved a narrow beam through the dark, revealing claw-like branches and patches of moss that glistened like wet skin. Will, I shouted. My voice echoed back, hollow and small. Over here. His voice was closer now, just beyond the next cluster of trees. I pushed forward, ignoring the way the branches seemed to reach for me, snagging my clothes and hair. And then I saw him. He was crouched in a clearing, his back to me, his body shaking like he was sobbing. Relief flooded through me as I rushed toward him. "Will, I'm here. Are you okay?" He didn't respond. "Will?" I hesitated, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Something was wrong. His shoulders moved in jerky, unnatural spasms, and the sounds he made weren't sobs. They were wet, guttural noises, like something trying to speak through a mouthful of blood. I stepped closer, my headlamp catching his face as he turned to look at me. It wasn't him. Oh, it wore his face, his sharp cheekbones, his crooked smile, even the faint scar above his eyebrow. But the eyes were wrong. Too large, too black, and they didn't blink. His mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, splitting at the corners like overripe fruit. And then it started to change. The skin rippled, sliding over muscle and bone like a snake shedding its scales. Will's face melted away, replaced by something raw and glistening, its features twisted and incomplete. It looked like it had been stitched together from parts that didn't belong. A mouth too wide, hands with fingers that bent the wrong way, a body that shuddered and popped as it reassembled itself into something inhuman. "Run," it rasped in a voice that was both his and not his. "Run before I finish." I stumbled back, tripping over roots and rocks, my headlamp swinging wildly. The thing took a step toward me, its movements jerky and wrong, as if it wasn't used to walking in its new skin. I turned and ran, the forest closing around me, the shadows thick and suffocating. Behind me, I could hear it moving, faster than any human should, its limbs cracking and snapping as it gave chase. It called my name in Will's voice, over and over, sometimes pleading, sometimes laughing. "Jake, come back. Don't leave me." When I burst back into the campsite, the others were waiting, their faces pale and frightened. "What happened?" Jim asked, grabbing my shoulders. I couldn't speak. I just stared at the woods, waiting for the thing to follow. But it didn't. The forest was silent, almost too silent, as if it was holding its breath. The others didn't believe me at first. They said it was the dark, my imagination, the legend getting under my skin. But when we packed up to leave the next morning, I noticed something in the dirt near the edge of the woods. A single footprint. It was Will's, but it was too large, and the toes ended in sharp, claw-like points. That was the last time I went camping. But even now, years later, I still hear it sometimes. Will's voice calling for help in the middle of the night. And I know, deep down, that one day I'll answer. Story 3. The night started out like any other camping trip. It was me, my best friend Kara, and a couple of cheap sleeping bags stuffed into a small borrowed tent. We were excited, giddy from the thrill of being out in the woods alone. No parents, no Wi-Fi, just the sound of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. We'd set up camp near the edge of Blackthorn Forest, a place with a reputation for being unsettling. People whispered about strange disappearances and sightings of shadowy figures in the woods. But Kara, always the skeptic, laughed off the stories. "It's just a bunch of urban legends to keep kids from sneaking out here," she said. I wanted to believe her. That night, the air was heavy, like it was holding its breath. We built a small fire, roasted some marshmallows, and swapped ghost stories. Kara, ever the brave one, dared me to tell the scariest story I knew. I stammered my way through a tale about a ghostly camper who steals souls. She rolled her eyes and called it cliché. Around midnight, the fire burned down to glowing embers, and we crawled into our sleeping bags. The tent was cramped but cozy, and despite the eerie stories, I fell asleep to the rhythm of the forest, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and the distant hoot of an owl. Then I woke up to the sound of dripping. At first, I thought it was dew sliding off the tent. The sound was soft, rhythmic, like the gentle tap of rain. But it wasn't raining. I reached out groggily and brushed the fabric of the tent above me. My fingers came away wet and sticky. Blood. My stomach twisted as I stared at my hand in the faint light of the moon filtering through the tent. The metallic smell hit me next, sharp and unmistakable. Kara, I whispered, shaking her sleeping bag. Wake up. No response. Kara, I said louder, panic creeping into my voice. I yanked her sleeping bag, but it was flat and empty. My breath hitched as I unzipped the tent, my heart pounding like a drum. Outside, the ground was smeared with dark, wet streaks, drag marks. They trailed from the entrance of the tent into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. Kara, I screamed, my voice echoing through the woods. Then I heard it, a scream, sharp and desperate, coming from deep in the forest. It was her. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack, hands trembling so badly I almost dropped it, and ran toward the sound. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating trees that seemed to loom closer with every step. The air felt colder, thicker, like it was trying to choke me. Kara, I shouted again, my voice breaking. Another scream answered, this one more distant, as if something, or someone, was dragging her further away. My flashlight flickered, the beam stuttering as if it didn't want to see what lay ahead. The drag marks grew fresher, wetter, and the smell of blood thickened. I stumbled over a root and nearly fell face first into a patch of disturbed earth. There, half buried, was her sleeping bag. It was shredded, the fabric soaked with dark stains. My hands shook as I reached for it, pulling it free from the dirt. That's when I saw them. Eyes, dozens of them, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like tiny mirrors. They blinked, shifting in the shadows, too high to belong to any animal I knew. And then they moved closer. The first figure stepped into the light. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that bent at wrong angles. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over bones that jutted like knives. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a blank, featureless void. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing tilted its head as if studying me, then opened a mouth that wasn't there a second ago. A guttural, wet growl erupted, and behind it, the others moved closer. And that's when I saw Kara. She was hanging limp in the arms of one of the creatures, her head lolling to the side, her face pale and streaked with blood. Her eyes flickered open for a brief second, and her lips formed one word: run. I ran. Branches whipped at my face. Roots tried to trip me, but I didn't stop. The sound of wet, heavy footsteps followed. Too close, too fast. I burst out of the forest and into the clearing where our tent still stood, smeared with blood. The flashlight died just as I reached the tent. I dove inside, zipping it shut as if the thin nylon could protect me. The footsteps stopped outside, and then silence. I sat there, clutching the dead flashlight, listening to my own ragged breathing. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I didn't move until the first light of dawn seeped through the fabric of the tent. When I finally unzipped it, the clearing was empty. No blood, no drag marks, no sign of Kara. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something new. Her necklace, lying in the dirt. It was soaked in blood. I never found her. To this day, I still hear her scream in my dreams, echoing through the dark woods. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see those blank faces staring back at me, waiting. Story 4. I had heard the stories about Shadow Lake long before I ever set foot near it. They were the kind of tales that people whispered around campfires, the kind that made you laugh nervously and check your surroundings when you were alone in the dark. The whispering dead, they called them, voices that came from beneath the ground, calling to anyone who dared camp near the lake. My friends and I weren't superstitious though. We were young, full of that naive bravado you only get when you're invincible in your own mind. We laughed about the stories, tossed a few jokes about the whispering dead, and headed for the abandoned campground, the one nobody used anymore because it had a reputation for being haunted. There was something unsettling about the place the moment we arrived. The air felt heavy, the trees too close together, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was like the forest was trying to keep us in, to keep us from leaving. But we brushed it off, figured it was all just overgrown woods and our imaginations running wild. We set up camp near the lake, a few tents scattered around a small clearing. As evening fell, we gathered around the fire, the crackling of the flames the only sound breaking the silence of the woods. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. At first, it was just a soft murmur, like voices on the wind. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the others had heard it too. The sound was faint at first, too soft to make out the words, but there was a rhythm to it, like a chant that echoed just beneath the surface. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, his voice tense. "Probably just the wind," I replied, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The voices grew louder, clearer. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something far darker. It was like 100 whispers calling our names, murmuring from beneath our feet, just below the soil. It was coming from the ground itself, and as I listened, I could feel it a pulse in my chest. The ground was alive, breathing, waiting. I stared at the earth beneath me, my heartbeat quickening. Then the ground shifted. It wasn't a tremor or an earthquake. It was more like a deep, unnatural movement, like something stirring beneath the surface. I felt the dirt shift under my boots, the ground softening as if it was pulling me down. "Guys, what's happening?" I could barely get the words out. Before anyone could respond, skeletal hands erupted from the soil. They clawed their way up, fingers long and brittle, their nails like broken bones scraping against the earth. There were too many to count, reaching, grasping, their thin, white fingers like the hands of corpses long buried. I could hear them whispering louder now, the voices no longer muffled. They weren't just calling our names anymore. They were begging. "Help us," they said, their voices a chorus of hollow desperation. My heart hammered in my chest as I stepped back, my legs trembling. I could see the faces of the dead in the soil now, twisted and decayed, their eyes wide with eternal fear. Their mouths opened, but no sound came out, only the whispers beneath the ground. "Run!" I shouted, and it was as though the others had been waiting for that moment. We all bolted, stumbling over roots and rocks, not daring to look back. But no matter how fast we ran, I could still hear the whispers following us, trailing behind like a dark shadow. We didn't stop until we reached the car, breathless, our bodies covered in dirt and fear. As we drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the skeletal hands clawing at the car, dragging us back to the lake. I never went back to Shadow Lake. None of us did. The campground near the lake is still abandoned. And whenever I hear a soft whisper on the wind, I remember those voices from beneath the ground. They still call to me sometimes, but now I know better. Some stories are true, and Shadow Lake, that's one of them. Story 5. I never believed in superstitions. Not really. Campers talk about ghosts, curses, and spirits in the woods, but it's always just a way to pass the time, to make the night feel more thrilling. We've been out here for hours, laughing around the fire, trading stories, and drinking beers like we always did. Nothing unusual, nothing to worry about. But then, the fire wouldn't stay lit. At first, it was a minor inconvenience. We'd gathered dry wood, made the pile nice and sturdy, but the flames flickered and died almost as soon as we lit it. The first time we shrugged it off, wind, maybe, or just bad luck. We relit it. It died again. A few more attempts, and the fire was barely a whisper of orange in the dark. "Maybe the wood's wet," I suggested, shuffling through the pile, checking for anything damp. But it wasn't the wood. It was something else, something in the air. When we finally managed to get it going, the fire roared to life, but not in the way it should have. The flames weren't the usual golden orange. No, they were ice blue, a strange, eerie color, like the glow of an electric arc. The smoke, instead of rising up into the night air, began to sink. It spiraled downwards, curling like some kind of dark serpent, thick and dense, flowing toward the ground. I felt a shiver creep up my spine, a feeling I couldn't shake, like I wasn't supposed to be here. But still, I pushed the fear down. "It's just the wind playing tricks on us," I said, though my voice sounded thinner than I wanted it to. The others didn't seem to notice. They were too busy watching the smoke, staring at the shapes that were starting to form in it. At first, they were just shadows, indistinct, like the blurry outline of someone moving in the distance. But the longer we watched, the clearer they became. Figures made of smoke. They twisted and writhed in the air, like they were caught in some invisible dance, their limbs jerking and snapping in unnatural angles. The fire crackled and popped as if it were alive, but none of us could look away. And then I saw it, a face. It was barely visible at first, just a hint of a twisted mouth, contorted in agony. The mouth moved, forming silent screams, stretching wider and wider, but no sound came. It was like the air itself was holding its breath, suffocating the very scream that wanted to escape. I looked at my friends, but their faces were frozen in place, their eyes wide with something between curiosity and horror. No one spoke. No one moved. The shapes in the smoke grew more distinct. There were more faces now, twisted, deformed, like they were the remnants of something long dead. Eyes wide and bulging, mouths stretched open in pain. They seemed to be watching us, pleading with us, begging for help, but there was nothing we could do. We were frozen, trapped by the sheer terror of what we were seeing. I wanted to move, to run, but something kept me rooted to the ground. Fear. That cold, paralyzing fear that claws at your throat and makes you feel small, insignificant. The fire hissed and popped, the ice blue flames seeming to dance with glee, as though it knew we were powerless against it. I don't know how long we stayed there, staring into the smoke. Time lost all meaning, the seconds stretching into eternity. I felt like I was suffocating, but not from lack of air. No, it was the weight of what I was witnessing. The realization that there were things in the world, things older than us, things that didn't belong in the daylight. Then, one of the shapes in the smoke reached toward me. It wasn't a hand, not exactly. It was something more fluid, like a tendril of dark fog, stretching toward my face. I could feel it, cold and clammy, brushing against my skin, and that's when I heard it. A voice. It was like a whisper, but it wasn't in my ears. It was in my head, inside my skull, cold and sharp as ice. You shouldn't have come here, it said. You disturbed the woods, and now you belong to it. Before I could react, the shape lunged, and the fire exploded with a violent, deafening roar. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the cold ground, the fire completely out, nothing but smoldering embers left. The smoke was gone. The faces were gone. It was just us, sitting in the dark, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. That night, we learned never to light a fire in cursed woods. We left at dawn, not saying a word, not even looking back at the place where we had camped. I don't know what we awakened that night, but I know it doesn't let you leave easily. And when I close my eyes, I still see those faces, still hear those silent screams. They won't let me forget. Story 6. It was supposed to be a weekend to remember, a group of friends, a little hiking, some campfires, and the quiet hum of nature around us. The kind of escape you dream about when the world gets too noisy. The mountains were high, the air crisp, and the forest was so thick with trees you could hardly see the sky. We pitched our tents, cracked open a few beers, and thought it was going to be the perfect getaway. It wasn't. It started when we ventured deeper into the woods, exploring a trail we hadn't noticed on the map. The sun was starting to dip low, casting long shadows across the path. But we were eager to see more, and besides, we had a ranger station nearby. We figured we couldn't get too lost. We didn't count on the forest playing tricks on us. We saw him first, at the edge of the trees. I didn't think anything of it at first, just a guy in uniform walking toward us. Park rangers were always around, keeping an eye on the trails. He was tall, a little too tall, but that didn't seem weird at first. His uniform was neat, his hat pulled low over his eyes, and the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt buzzed every few seconds. I remember thinking it was strange that he was out here this deep, away from the station. But still, nothing to be worried about, right? Evening, I called out to him, waving. He nodded slowly, but it felt off, like he was a little too deliberate. His walk wasn't right either. His legs didn't bend naturally. They straightened out with every step, almost as if he was walking with stiff, mechanical motions. It was odd, but he was just a ranger, I told myself. Maybe he had been on the job too long, or maybe I was just tired. You folks lost? His voice was deep, so deep it almost seemed to rumble in the air, hollow like it was coming from somewhere deep inside him, not his mouth. I stared at him for a second, trying to figure it out. Something about his voice didn't sit right. No, just exploring the trail, I said. Didn't expect to run into anyone out here. He took a step closer, and that's when I noticed his hands. They were wrong. His fingers were too long, longer than they should have been, and they curled in a way that didn't make sense. The nails were sharp, like claws, glinting in the low light. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I chalked it up to the creeping chill of the evening air. "You been out here long?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going, trying to ignore the way my heart started to beat faster. He didn't answer. Instead, he just stared at me. His eyes were hidden under the brim of his hat, but the weight of his gaze felt like it was pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. I glanced at my friends, hoping they didn't notice the way my palms were sweating. "You should head back to camp," he said finally. His words were slow, deliberate, like he was savoring them, and his breath came in short, raspy bursts. "It's not safe out here at night." "Yeah, we were just about to do that," I said, taking a step back. The last thing I wanted was to be alone with this guy, but I didn't want to seem rude. Then he turned toward the trees, his movements jerky and stiff. I felt an uneasy pull in my chest. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. He didn't walk like a man. It was like his legs were moving out of sync, a strange, almost robotic gait. "Thanks for the advice," I called after him, but he didn't reply. I should have kept walking, but something kept me staring at him as he moved into the trees. His back was to us now, and I thought I saw something strange in the way his body bent at the waist. His back arched in an unnatural way, like he was forcing himself to move against his own bones. Then he turned to face us again. I froze. His mouth, it opened wider than any humans could. I swear to God, it was like something out of a nightmare. His lips split, stretching beyond what should have been possible, and inside there were rows and rows of teeth. Not human teeth. Teeth like a shark's, long, needle-like, serrated. They gleamed in the dying light, and I felt my blood run cold. "Get back to camp now," he hissed. The words were louder this time, more menacing, and when he spoke, the ground beneath my feet seemed to hum, as if the very earth was reacting to him. Before I could move, he stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the trees as though the forest had swallowed him whole. I could hear my friends breathing behind me, but I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the dirt. "Let's go," I finally whispered, my voice barely above a breath. We didn't look back. We ran back to camp, our feet stumbling over rocks and roots, our hearts pounding in our chests. I don't think any of us spoke a word until we got to the safety of the firelight, but we all knew something was wrong. The forest wasn't safe. Not anymore. Later that night, we packed up and left, every shadow in the woods watching us, waiting for the moment when we'd be foolish enough to return. I don't know what he was. A man? A monster? I don't know if it even matters. But whatever it was out there. And I don't think I'll ever be able to forget the way his mouth opened. The way he smiled. Story 7. The day was hot, the air thick with humidity. The kind of heat that made your skin stick to your clothes and your lungs feel heavy. We'd been hiking all day and reached a lake just before sunset. A quiet place, tucked deep in the forest, with the trees almost closing in on the water. The locals had warned us about it, but we laughed it off. Some superstitious mumbo-jumbo. The drowning shadows, they called it. They said it was cursed, that the lake had a mind of its own, and it claimed the souls of those who weren't careful. We were young, and we weren't about to let a silly story ruin our fun. We jumped in without a second thought. The water was colder than I expected, sharp against my skin, but it felt good after hours of trekking through the woods. The others were already splashing around, their laughter echoing across the water. I swam a little farther out, enjoying the stillness that seemed to surround the lake. That's when I felt it. At first, I thought it was just seaweed brushing against my legs, soft like fingers slipping across my skin. But then it tightened like something was holding me down. The chill that crawled up my spine wasn't from the water anymore. My heart hammered in my chest as I kicked, trying to break free, but the grip was too strong. My foot jerked, dragged. I panicked, but there was no air in my lungs to scream. Something else pulled me deeper, something far darker than seaweed. It was like being sucked into the mouth of something massive, unseen, just a deep, suffocating pressure. My breath was a strangled gasp, my legs kicking desperately. I could see the surface, the fading light above, but it felt so far away. My ankle burned like it was on fire, and for a second, I thought I was going to drown. The lake, the thing in the lake, was pulling me under, and I wasn't strong enough to fight it. I don't know how long it was before I broke free. One final yank, and I shot up to the surface, gasping for air. The water felt warmer now, the pain in my foot throbbing as I fought to stay afloat. I spun around, searching for my friends, but when I looked back to the shore, I froze. They were still in the water, but something wasn't right. Their heads bobbed up and down like usual, but their eyes were wrong. I couldn't see their pupils, just black, endless holes, and their smiles. They were too wide, stretching across their faces like the grin of something that had never known real joy. I felt my stomach churn, my blood turning cold. "Come back down," one of them whispered, his voice hollow, like it came from far away. His lips didn't move the way they should have, like the words were coming from inside my head. My friend, Matt, who had always joked around, his face twisted into something unrecognizable. Another voice joined in, soft, dripping with something dark and wet. "You're one of us now." It wasn't human. Not anymore. The water rippled around them, unnatural, like the lake itself was breathing, alive in a way that felt wrong. I couldn't stay. Something deep inside my gut screamed for me to swim to shore, to get out of that cursed place. I kicked harder, my body shaking as I pulled myself away from them. But they didn't move. They just stayed there, floating in the water, their eyes locked on me. I made it to the shore in a panic, gasping, my skin covered in goosebumps. I turned back, expecting to see them right behind me, but they were gone, vanished into the murky water. I waited, trembling on the shore. The silence was deafening, the water still once more. My mind raced, but my body was frozen. I told myself I had to go back for them. I had to make sure they were okay. But when I looked out at the lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't the same anymore. They weren't my friends, not the way they used to be. Something else had taken them. And then, just as the last sliver of light disappeared behind the trees, I heard them again. "Come back down," they whispered, their voices calling from deep within the lake. But it wasn't them. It wasn't them at all. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the truck, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was down there in the water was still watching, still waiting, and it wanted me to join them. Story 8. We were a group of 5, as foolish as any young campers, eager for a weekend escape from the noise of the city. The woods were supposed to be our refuge, quiet, calm, and isolated from the bustle of the world. But the moment we arrived, something felt off. It wasn't the wind or the way the trees bent just a little too far over the trail. It was the stillness. It was too quiet. That night, around the campfire, we laughed like nothing could touch us. We made our jokes and roasted marshmallows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't a creepy, instinctual kind of fear. It was more like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting. Waiting for what? I didn't know. It wasn't until around 2 a.m. when I finally couldn't ignore the sound anymore. It was faint at first, like an echo carried by the wind. Soft, haunting, and unbearably sad, as if the world was crying. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, wondering if anyone else had heard it. "Do you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. At first, they laughed it off. Ethan joked about it being a coyote, and Jess said it was just the wind. But I knew better. This wasn't a coyote, or the wind, or anything natural. It was something else. A voice. "Shut up, Arlo. You're just spooked," Ethan said, shaking his head and returning to his phone. But I couldn't stop listening. The singing grew louder, clearer, like a chorus of voices layered on top of each other. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, eerie and full of sorrow. It was coming from deeper in the woods. "Come on," I said. "We need to check it out." I should have stayed put. Should have stayed by the fire. Should have been smart. But curiosity got the better of me. Jess and Ethan reluctantly followed, their voices dripping with hesitation. The others, as usual, were too eager to follow my lead. We wandered further into the forest, the singing wrapping around us like an invisible cloak. With every step, it became clearer, more tangible, until it was all I could hear. There was no room for anything else. And then we found it, a clearing, in the middle of the forest, just far enough away from our camp that the firelight didn't touch the edges of the trees. At the center, a circle of stones, jagged and worn with time, and sitting in the middle of the circle, as if waiting for us, was an old woman. Her hair was white as snow, her skin pale, almost translucent like parchment. Her eyes, though, were the worst part. Empty, hollow. They looked right through me, and I felt like I was sinking, like I wasn't even standing in that spot anymore, just falling into her gaze. The singing stopped when we entered the clearing. Her lips parted, but the voice that came out wasn't just hers. It was a chorus, 100 voices layered on top of each other, echoing in perfect harmony, filling the air with an overwhelming sadness. The words didn't make sense, but the feeling they carried did. It was a lament, a grief so ancient, so deep, that it felt like the earth itself had been crying for centuries. She turned her head slowly, locking eyes with me. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence, pure and suffocating. And then she whispered, in a voice so quiet I could barely hear it above my pounding heart. Run, before the song claims you. I froze. A chill ran through me, deep into my bones. I wanted to turn, to flee, but something in the air held me there, rooted to the spot. I glanced at Jess and Ethan, but they weren't listening. They were mesmerized, their faces pale, their eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the woman as if hypnotized. The woman raised a thin, bony hand and beckoned us forward. Come closer, she said, and the way her voice felt, it was as if it was pushing me towards her. My legs moved without my command, like they were no longer mine to control. Don't, I gasped, but it was too late. Jess took a step forward. Ethan followed, and then, just as I was about to turn and run, just as my body screamed to escape, the woman's voice rose again. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream, louder than any human voice could ever be, vibrating the air around us. The sound was unbearable, as if it were reaching deep into our souls, pulling at something fragile, something forgotten. And I saw them, faces, dozens of them, twisted and contorted, emerging from the shadows between the trees. They were pale, lifeless, dead. They were the ones singing. They were the ones calling us. I broke free. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, my heart in my throat, my breath ragged. I didn't look back. I didn't dare to. Behind me, I heard Ethan and Jess scream. Once, and then nothing. The singing continued, so close now that it felt like it was inside my head. By the time I reached camp, I was shaking, drenched in sweat, the taste of fear still heavy on my tongue. The fire had long since burned out, but the embers still flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. I turned to look for them, but they weren't there. Ethan, Jess, gone. That was 3 weeks ago. I thought I could escape it. I thought maybe it was just a nightmare, a horrible hallucination brought on by too many beers and too little sleep. But every night since then, every time I close my eyes, I hear the song. It's still out there, somewhere in the woods. And every night, I hear the voices calling me. I know what they want. They want me to join them, and soon I will. Story 9. The night we camped in that forest, I thought I heard the trees whispering. At first, it was just a soft rustle, a sound you'd expect from the wind. But as the darkness deepened, the rustling grew louder, more purposeful, like the woods were alive and conspiring with each other. I remember the moon was barely peeking through the thick canopy of leaves above us. The air was damp, colder than it should have been for summer, and every step I took was muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles and moss underfoot. It felt as though the woods were holding its breath, waiting for something. We'd heard stories, of course. Everyone who lived near those woods had heard the rumors, but I didn't believe them. Not really. Stories about people getting lost, strange noises, and the way the forest seemed to change when the sun went down. But we were young, reckless, and far too confident in our ability to navigate any woods, no matter how old or haunted. At first, it was just the wind, if it was even wind, making the trees sway in unnatural directions. Branches twisting, creaking, curling in on themselves like fingers clawing toward the sky. But there was no breeze, no gust, nothing to explain it. The trees just moved, slow, deliberate, like something was pulling them. I remember thinking, this isn't right. But I kept telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. Then came the ground. It started small, a subtle shift, almost imperceptible. But after a few minutes, it became undeniable. The earth beneath us was breathing. I'm not joking. It was as if the ground itself was alive. You could see it, the ground rising and falling, pushing up, then sinking back down in a rhythm like a slow, steady pulse. I thought I was going crazy. I was about to call it out, to laugh it off as some weird trick of the mind, but then I saw the others. They were looking down, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the same realization. We weren't alone in these woods. There's something wrong, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She was always the first to sense when something wasn't right, always the one to make everyone pause and question whether we should have gone deeper into the forest. I nodded, unable to speak. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to find the way back to camp. But as I looked at the trees again, something was different. The path that had been so clear before, so sure, wasn't there anymore. It had twisted, curved. It no longer led us back the way we came. It felt as though the woods themselves were reshaping, trapping us in their labyrinthine grip. "Where's the trail?" Ben asked, his voice rising in panic. There was no trail. Not anymore. The woods had swallowed it whole. We tried to retrace our steps, to find the clearing where we'd set up camp earlier. But the more we walked, the further away it seemed. Every turn led us back to the same spot. Trees that looked like they were watching us, branches groaning as they swayed closer. The moonlight barely made it through, casting shadows that danced on the edge of our vision, as though someone was moving just beyond the trees, always just out of reach. "It's messing with us," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "It's the forest." I thought she was being dramatic, but then I saw the way the trees moved. They were no longer swaying with the wind. They were stretching toward us, their trunks bending, twisting, their limbs reaching out like the hands of something hungry. "Run," I shouted. We all turned to run, but our feet felt heavy, as though the ground itself was pulling us back. The earth rose and fell beneath us, pushing us forward and then pulling us back, as if the woods were trying to swallow us whole. And then, in a moment of pure panic, I heard the sound that froze me in place. A low, guttural growl, a vibration in the earth so deep I felt it in my chest. The trees were no longer swaying. They were leaning toward us, like an army of monsters closing in. "We have to get out of here," Ben screamed. But no matter how hard we ran, the path was always the same. It never changed. The trees grew closer, their limbs twisting into shapes too unnatural to comprehend. And then we all saw it. The face, one of the trees, its bark peeling back like skin, revealed a face. Not a human one, something ancient, with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide. It whispered to us, but the words didn't make sense. They didn't need to. The message was clear. The forest wanted us to stay. We stumbled backward, but the path shifted again, and suddenly, the trees parted just enough to reveal something even more horrifying. It wasn't just the trees that were alive. It was the whole forest. The air hummed with a strange energy. The ground pulsed, and the faces in the trees seemed to be smiling, waiting. That's when I understood. We weren't leaving, not unless the forest decided to let us go. We finally broke free from the forest grasp at dawn, stumbling out of the woods and back to the campsite. The others were still asleep, blissfully unaware of what we had just experienced. But I knew that the forest wasn't done with us. It was still breathing, still watching, and it was waiting for the right moment to come for us again. And I don't think we'll be able to run far enough next time. Story 10. It was supposed to be a typical camping trip. A few friends, a campfire, and the kind of laughter you only find when you're miles away from the real world. We pitched our tents just off the old trail, the one that no one dared to follow past dusk. But we weren't worried. We've been camping here before. At least that's what we told ourselves as we cracked open beers and settled around the fire. The smell of wood smoke filled the air, and for a while, everything felt right. The fire was our anchor. The orange glow painted the trees in an eerie light, casting long shadows that danced and twisted in the night. We took turns poking at the flames, watching them crackle and hiss. The crackling sound was almost soothing, like the earth was speaking to us in a language we couldn't understand. But then I saw something. It wasn't much at first, just a flicker of movement. The fire flared up briefly, and in the middle of it, there were faces. At least, I thought they were faces. They appeared in the flames, distorted and blurry, like something trapped inside the fire, screaming but soundless. I froze, staring hard at the flames. There were several of them, eyes wide, mouths open in silent terror. They weren't just in my head. I could see them clear as day. My heart started pounding. I didn't know what I was looking at. "Hey, you alright?" My friend Steve's voice snapped me out of it. His voice casual, like we were sitting around a normal fire. But I could tell from the way his eyes flicked to the fire that he saw it too. I didn't answer at first. I just kept staring at the flames, my chest tightening. I see faces in the fire," I whispered. It sounded ridiculous even to my own ears. Steve laughed. What, like the usual campfire stories? Come on, man. It's just your imagination. You've had a few too many drinks already. But I couldn't look away. The faces were clearer now, the expressions more vivid. The eyes, they were desperate, filled with horror. And then, as if the fire was playing some sick game with me, Steve's face appeared in the flames. I gasped, my throat going dry. His face, his exact face, was staring back at me, eyes wide, lips trembling in silent scream. I reached for him, wanted to shout, but no sound came from my mouth. The fire crackled, spitting embers, and for a moment, everything felt wrong, like time had stopped and the world was waiting for something to happen. "Steve," I whispered, my voice shaky. "Steve, look." He turned to me, confused, his brow furrowing as he followed my gaze to the fire. His expression faltered, and I saw it. The moment he realized what I had already known. There, clear as day, was his own face, contorted in agony, trapped in the flames. "What the hell is that?" Steve muttered, standing up suddenly, backing away from the fire. But his face stayed in the flames, screaming silently. The others noticed then. They all stared at the fire, and I could feel the chill creeping into the air, the kind that comes when you realize something is terribly, horribly wrong. But no one else saw it, not like I did. They just saw normal flames, dancing in the night. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew it wasn't just my imagination. As the night dragged on, we all tried to go to sleep, but no one could shake the feeling that the fire was watching us. We each huddled in our tents, listening to the wind whistle through the trees. But as I lay there, trying to block out the images of those faces, something else happened. A sound, a faint whisper, almost like someone calling my name. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, straining to hear it. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Help me." It was Steve's voice. I jumped out of my tent, running toward the campfire. But when I got there, the fire was dim, barely more than a few glowing embers. There was no sign of Steve. The faces had vanished too, leaving nothing but the crackling of the dying fire. "Steve," I called, my voice breaking. Nothing, only silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl like the world is holding its breath. The next morning, we found Steve's sleeping bag empty, his gear untouched. It was as though he had just vanished, leaving nothing behind but a memory, and the image of his face, screaming, pleading for help, in the fire. We left camp early, none of us speaking much. The air felt too heavy, and the forest too quiet, like something was watching us from the shadows. And every time I close my eyes, I still see it, his face frozen in the flames, screaming without sound. The last thing I saw before the fire died. I'm not sure what I saw that night, or what happened to Steve. But I know this. Some things are meant to stay hidden, and I can't help but wonder if I've seen a glimpse of something that wasn't meant to be seen. Something that's still out there, watching. Now, whenever I see a campfire, I can't help but stare into the flames. You never know when those faces might come back.